That aircraft stank all flight, every flight, of this vomit smell.
My doctor is completely convinced that the symptoms that I suffer from are related to and solely caused by the aircraft exposure to fumes.
Everyone noticed the smells and it was just considered normal. We've had passengers sitting at the forward of the aircraft using their boarding passes to wave in front of their noses where it's been that strong.
I could not have opened my doors in an emergency, and that's what was the major concern for me, is this was a safety problem as well as a health issue.
When I first started flying, I noticed a peculiar odor such as a gymnasium, a dirty sock odor, and we would look for someone with their shoes off. We'd walk down the aisle, and it became a joke because it became such a part of our atmosphere. But now we've learned that that dirty sock odor means that there's a toxin in the aircraft, and it's not a joke.
So it's the same thing. And we're so unhappy, but we sit back and stare. We're not asking the questions.
For over 20 years, some airline crews and passengers have become ill following exposure to contaminated air on board commercial airlines. On some occasions, flight safety has been seriously compromised. The airline industry says this is a rare event and there's nothing to worry about. However, a growing number of crews, doctors and scientists disagree. Our investigation looks at the evidence and asks what are the effects of breathing contaminated air.
I was flying the sector, and about a minute after takeoff, I felt so bad I had to hand control over to the other pilot. I subsequently wrote a report about that flight, and I was rung up by the company and asked to change the report.
Headache is very typical during these times, and mental confusion.
But I recall one incident where I couldn't even remember whether I'd put the undercarriage up for the first officer or not. And that sort of thing is worrying to an airline captain.
And I couldn't even add up what I'd written down on the piece of paper. I couldn't even I could read it, but I couldn't work it out in my mind how many cans of Coke I needed. And I felt really dizzy. I almost felt like I was drunk, like sort of feeling, and the other girl felt the same.
It was just a given amongst crew members that it was a normal smell, and it was part of flying, and you just put up with it. No one really questioned it until, of course, I had a major incident. I became very ill, and that was when I questioned it.
I've had an experience where we had a fume event and we were taken out the back door and passengers were taken to the emergency room by ambulance.
I was on United Airlines Flight 201 on December 13th of the year 2000, flying from Dulles Airport in Washington to San Diego. Immediately after takeoff, the cabin filled with a very noxious odor. Right after the incident, the day after the incident on December 14th of 2000, I called United because I woke up and I was extremely sick. I was coughing, I had blurred vision, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I called United, they told me I would have to write a letter to find out what had happened. I wrote the letter immediately. It took them 2 months to get back to me and let me know that I was exposed to a jet engine oil leak.
All aircraft engines need oils to work properly, just like car engines do. The important thing is to keep the oil in the engine and not allow it to contaminate the air supply, which also comes from the engines. If the air from the engines becomes contaminated, then both the passengers and crew may be affected. So how does this all work and what's going wrong? Aircraft need air to pressurise the cabin and to allow occupants to survive in comfort. This air comes from the engines. Air entering the engines follows one of three routes. It can pass by the front fan stage and, without being compressed, be expelled out the back as part of the propulsion process. This is known as bypass air. Or it can pass through the core of the engine where it's compressed, combusted and expelled out the back as hot, fast-moving air. And finally, some of this compressed air, which is very hot due to compression, is bled off before it enters the combustion process. This is known as bleed air. The hot bleed air is then passed to the air conditioning packs in the aircraft, where it's cooled before being introduced into the cabin and cockpit. This air pressurizes the aircraft and provides a comfortable environment for the passengers and crew whilst the aircraft flies at high altitude. The hot bleed air should normally only be clean outside air. When you have a poorly designed engine or inefficient engine seals, this bleed air can become contaminated with engine oil or hydraulic lubricants. This contaminated bleed air is sent off to the cabin and cockpit, where it's breathed in by passengers and crew. It can often be sensed as an unpleasant, dirty, sock-like smell. The contaminated air entering the cabin may cause crews and passengers to have some initial symptoms of exposure, such as headaches, nausea and fatigue. But most people usually walk off the aircraft unaware of how this was caused. Some aircraft and engine designs are more problematic than others. So why do today's jet aircraft use engine bleed air? The decision to use bleed air drawn from the engines for pressurization, cabin air supply in commercial jets dates back to the de Havilland Comet, which first flew in 1949. Ironically, the early jet aircraft only used the bleed air as part of the process, but did not allow it to feed directly into the aircraft cabin, as they had significant concerns about the air becoming contaminated. However, by sending bleed air directly to the aircraft cabin via the air conditioning packs, the engines would burn less fuel. So economics prevailed over potential health risks, and the problem of contaminated air in commercial jet aircraft was born. And 50 years later, industry is still using the same basic principle. So crews and passengers claim they're sick from contaminated air exposure. What are the medical experts finding? We contacted over 100 crews and passengers, all of whom had experienced short and or long-term medical effects as a result of breathing contaminated air. Some can no longer work as a result of this, and their lives have been totally affected. The most common symptoms experienced include the following: respiratory, neuropsychological, gastrointestinal, neurotoxic and cardiovascular symptoms, and others such as eye, nose and throat irritations, weakness and fatigue, skin problems, chemical sensitivity. We found the same symptoms being experienced all around the world.
I haven't flown an aircraft in over 6 years, as I'm no longer able to hold a medical certificate to fly as a commercial pilot. Yeah, I can run and I can ride, I look pretty normal, but I have head pressure every single day, permanent. It doesn't go away. I have fatigue, problems with chemicals. I have problems processing information, recall of short-term information, feeling of not enough oxygen, nausea and so on. And I'm left with these symptoms and they never go away.
I have chemical sensitivity and chronic fatigue, headaches, hormonal imbalances. Mental ability is dramatically diminished. I have periods of confusion, inability to organize the most simplest things.
The symptoms that I experienced after the flight changed my life. I had chronic fatigue and continue to have chronic fatigue, sleep disorders, short-term memory problems, and cognitive dysfunctions, all which prohibit me from doing the jobs that I did before. These are issues that will be with me probably the rest of my life and have changed my life permanently.
My son, who was conceived while I was flying on the 146, and my husband was a first officer flying the 146, has been born with a genetic syndrome. And we both have chemical damage to some chromosomes, about 3 each. The only environment that I've been exposed to chemicals in my working career and my social life has been through the aircraft, through the airline industry.
The symptoms that I suffered started with nausea and headaches, loss of voice, chest pains, breathlessness. I had fatigue, extreme fatigue at times, tingling fingers. I had memory problems, concentration problems, and heart palpitations.
We took this list of symptoms to medical specialists and asked if this is what they expected and if this is what they were seeing in those who had been exposed to oils which contain organophosphates and other chemicals.
Well, in a crew, the route would be by inhalation. So I would expect to have symptoms of the respiratory tract initially, and then also symptoms in the central nervous system, that is the brain.
Yes, toxic encephalopathy means central nervous system damage, and the central nervous system is really the brain. You can have a short-term effect where within a day or two the patient feels better, meaning a day or two after exposure has ceased. Let's say they are exposed and then they go home, and over the weekend or for a few days they may well get better and nothing may happen. The patients I see are the ones who are exposed and have long-term effects, meaning that even though they are not exposed anymore, they continue to have problems with concentration, the way their mind works, with memory, especially short-term memory, balance, etc., and lung problems.
Though they start off with complaining of symptoms in relationship to a smell in the aircraft, they commonly develop an intolerance to a wide range of pretty well unrelated chemicals in the community.
Well, I've had patients that have had MS-like symptoms or tremors that could be attributed to Parkinson's that were told by doctors that really weren't aware of the problem, didn't see the big picture. They could have this. I've had several patients who've been told they could have MS, but on closer examination they fit into the pattern of what we're seeing with the other air crews. So I think a lot of these people are being misdiagnosed.
The lack of information from the industry and from the government also affects the victims of these exposures by a lack of information to the medical community. They don't know what to do with us. I've been labeled a manic depressive, a woman with panic disorder. I've been put on antidepressives. I've been told I hyperventilate. I've been told a whole host of things that are just so far from the truth.
The main problems that I have seen when I've tested these people have been memory and concentration difficulties, but probably the most common has been an impairment in their capacity to process information quickly. And I did a number of tests in this area, and 87.5% of the people in my study that I did were affected in this way.
But certainly in all the patients that I've examined, there has been evidence of lung injury. Some of them show, or in fact all of them show, evidence of impairment of oxygen uptake. Certainly in my mind there is no doubt that long-term exposure will cause long-term damage and, in my opinion, permanent lung damage.
That's what I'm seeing with patients. I'm seeing patients who have repeated exposures, who have lung, brain, multi-system problems as a result of breathing in these fumes. Of course, it's a considerable concern.
Crews and passengers around the world describe the same symptoms, and the medical specialists confirm this. The common link appears to be the lubricants. We know that oil does contaminate the air supply.
The source of the odours has been identified as predominantly mobile jet oil 2, leaking past oil seals in the engines and/or auxiliary power unit and into the air conditioning system.
ExxonMobil, well known as a fuel company, also manufacture one of the most widely used engine oils, Mobile Jet Oil 2. So what ingredients in the oil are of concern? The oil is a complex mixture of chemicals. One of these is an organophosphate called TCP, which is a generic name for 10 structurally similar compounds. Organophosphates are synthetic chemicals designed to be toxic and were developed during the early 1900s. Conceived as insecticides, they've also been developed to become the most feared chemical weapon, such as sarin nerve gas. Organophosphates have been linked to problems with insecticide poisoning, sheep-dip farmers, and the Gulf War syndrome. Now it's believed it is this ingredient in the oil which may be playing a part in the sickness seen in crews and passengers. Many papers and tests have explored the issue of the toxicology of the oils. They all conclude that crews and passengers will be safe. The question is, who had the papers written? ExxonMobil. Has an independent paper ever been written to support their view? We didn't find any.
One significant concern with the toxicity testing for these engine oils and hydraulic fluids in the aviation industry is that the toxicity testing focuses on hens drinking these products under controlled laboratory conditions. So to make the jump from hens drinking products to people inhaling heated engine oils and hydraulic fluids in a reduced oxygen environment is just absurd.
ExxonMobil state that their product causes no medical effects in crews and passengers based on their oral testing of the product on hens, even though the inhalation route, which is the way crews and passengers would receive the oil, is seen as a far more toxic route of exposure.
If we extrapolate from this to inhalation, we'd expect that inhalation would be even more effective because inhaled chemicals usually reach the brain much faster and at a much higher concentration.
When contaminated air enters the cabin, it is breathed in by passengers and crews. The contaminated air is inhaled and therefore goes straight into the lungs and into the bloodstream, where it may travel quickly to the brain. The initial symptoms of exposure may be detected by smell or by a variety of physical symptoms, such as headaches, nausea or fatigue. This repeated low-level exposure to contaminated air that contains toxic compounds like the organophosphates MOCP, DOCP and TOCP is believed to be a factor in the illnesses seen in crews and passengers.
Repeated low-level exposure results in long-term brain damage that is resulting from chronic toxicity of organophosphates. This effect results usually in memory loss, cognition problems, muscle weakness, as well as fatigue. This is directly related to this low-level exposure, repeated low-level exposure to organophosphates that they may not show OPIDN when we use the hen test, but we actually can show that these chemicals produce brain damage and cell death.
Interestingly, all of the symptoms just given are found in crews and passengers.
What really upsets me is that this was well known by the Health and Safety Executive in 1998, medical aspects of work-related exposures to organophosphates. And it says here in black and white, it says acute and repeated exposures can produce harmful effects in man, and it has been suggested that chronic exposure at lower doses may cause long-term ill health.
What is the independent expert opinion?
The two main hazardous ingredients that I'm worried about are N-phenyl 1-naphthylamine, or PAN, which is an antioxidant present in a concentration of 1%, and Tricresyl phosphate, which is a group of 10 structurally similar chemicals that together are in the oil in a concentration of 3% and are used as a wear additive and as a flame retardant. When Mobil say their product is not harmful, when they write to the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission here in Australia and insist to them that it's not hazardous, that's a sequence of events which I take great exception to. Both Tricresyl phosphate at the levels that we've discussed and PAN at 1% would, in my view, indicate that this chemical is very easily classifiable as a hazardous substance. Okay, let's look at the can. This is the can that the oil comes in, it's a 1 quart can. It has a number of warnings on it. It says contains Tricresyl phosphate. It says swallowing this product can cause nervous system disorders including paralysis. It says prolonged or breathing of oil mist or prolonged or repeated skin contact can cause nervous system effects. This is hardly a chemical that I would consider harmless.
And it's also consistent with the nature of the chemicals there, that we know that these are neurotoxins. So the organophosphates are well recognised for this, and the actual toxicology is well understood.
Is it just organophosphates that would concern you, or could it be a mixture of chemicals in the oils?
Oh, it would be a mixture of chemicals would concern me, because you really don't know what the synergistic effect of chemicals is. You might have one chemical on its own that is not quite so harmful, but when that is mixed with a number of others, that mix could be highly, highly toxic.
The aircraft industry has been singling out individual components rather than looking at the overall picture to a large extent, and that's what needs to be looked at. The overall combined effect is the important one. Now, we haven't discussed even the pyrolysis of these agents yet when they are heated to very high degrees of temperature, and consequently the carbon monoxide component is an important one as well.
I think it's really telling that the U.S. National Research Council Committee, a panel of scientists that was told to review problems with aircraft air quality for 1 year and issue a report, formally recommended that the US regulator require carbon monoxide monitors on all aircraft, and this recommendation has been ignored so far.
When we go to the public available documentation that's available, we find a certain level of one of the ingredients in the oil. That's Tricresyl Phosphate. This is the least toxic ingredient available in the least concentration. When we did the calculations for the other ortho ingredients, we found an absolute difference of 30,000 times what it would be if it was just the Tricresyl Phosphate, and in relative terms, a difference of 6 million. So Mobil are willing to tell you how much is available for the least toxic and the one in the lowest amount, but if you actually look at the rest of it, you get a vast difference in what the toxicology actually is.
We believe that Mobil Jet Oil 2 is in fact toxic. However, we do not see the product labelled as toxic, and we would like to see a clear determination by the National Occupational Health and Safety Council as to why their own guidelines, which as I said would indicate that Mobil Jet Oil 2 is toxic, is not so labelled.
Is engine oil leaking into the cabin air a new problem, or how long has the problem existed?
I have been aware of the toxic effects, long-lasting potentially toxic effects of oils and aircraft fuels for many years, more than 10 years. Why? Because I've seen a number of pilots, I've seen quite a number of flight attendants.
About 2/3 of the people that I flew with could actually smell the fumes. Of that 2/3 of the people, about half suffered symptoms in varying degrees.
Whenever a problem is found on an aircraft, the manufacturer will issue advice in a variety of ways. If the problem is deemed to relate to an unsafe condition that exists or is likely to exist, then the Civil Aviation Regulator should issue an airworthiness directive, making it mandatory to comply with the manufacturer's advice. We've seen nearly 100 bulletins and leaflets from manufacturers relating to the issue of contaminated air. As contaminated air is an unsafe condition, we asked a former pilot why they were not all made into airworthiness directives and how long this has been going on for.
These have been known about by industry for almost 20 years and have been dealt with almost exclusively, optionally, or as recommended only, not made mandatory. And almost 20 years later, crews and passengers are still breathing contaminated air.
In an industry that is well known for regulations to ensure flight safety, we asked what regulations does industry have to protect crews and passengers from contaminated air.
One of these is Airworthiness Ventilation Regulation 25831A and B. Part A reads, each passenger and crew compartment must be ventilated, and each crew compartment must have enough fresh air to enable crew members to perform their duties without undue discomfort or fatigue. Part B reads, crew and passenger compartment air must be free from harmful or hazardous concentrations of gases or vapours. Some in the airline industry are not adhering to these regulations, and many of the regulators are not enforcing these regulations. What is happening is that the airline commercial interest is being put ahead of aircraft flight safety and passenger and crew health.
Is an aircraft airworthy or fit to fly if FAR 25.831 cannot be met?
FAR 25831 is a design standard for certification. The continuing maintenance program for the aircraft is supposed to provide that for the facilities for the aircraft to continue to meet that standard, but experience has shown that this is not the case, and therefore in a legal situation I believe the aircraft couldn't be said to be totally airworthy. And I in fact issued the first airworthiness certificate for the BAE 146-300 series aircraft.
As the industry is not enforcing these regulations and seems happy to allow the problem to exist, is it because they see this as a rare event?
One Australian British Aerospace 146 operator has reported
one oil or fume-related incident in every 130 flights. Now that's almost every day. Whereas the British Civil Aviation Authority say that it only occurs once every 22,000 flights. Now that doesn't add up, does it? In a recent survey by BALPA of 100 or so pilots who replied to a 757 questionnaire, 1,700 fume and oil-related incidents were reported. Now that's an awful lot. It seems to me that this is being suppressed and that it's being underreported.
By far, most of the fume events that occur on the aeroplanes don't get reported. I would say it is way less than 10%. And of those events that do get reported, very, very few ever make it back to the official channels to the Civil Aviation Authority or to the Air Transport Safety Bureau. They get lost in the system.
Air contamination does not occur on every flight, but it is certainly not the rare event the UK CAA says it is. But that could be explained by the fact that it's being seriously underreported. Industry has spent years denying the problem and contradicting themselves, all in an effort not to link contaminated air to health effects. We've discovered hundreds of examples of this. In 2001, in a paper written for the CAA by Dr. J. Jenner, we have the statement: "It is unlikely that the symptoms reported in the cabin air quality instance are caused by pyrolysis products of lubricant leaking into the engine airflow." Then, in 2002, they changed their minds, and in the CAA FODCOM 21/2002, they state, although the exact cause of crew incapacitation is not yet known, the most probable source is oil leaking from the engines or APU and contaminating the air supply to the cabin and cockpit through the air conditioning system. Others in industry have other explanations.
During my court hearing with the Industrial Relations Court, National Jet stood up and in its testimony called the fume problem industrial hysteria.
In 2000, the House of Lords had an air travel and health inquiry which was meant to be objective and non-industry biased, but this is now questioned.
I met with the woman who was the chair of the House of Lords inquiry, Baroness Wilcox, and she admitted to me over lunch that she felt she was being snowed by the bureaucrats on her committee, but felt there was nothing she could do about it. I urged her to examine the evidence independently and write her own report. But quite clearly the House of Lords inquiry, again, was the report was pretty much a cover-up of the evidence which that inquiry was given.
So, the aviation regulators are not dealing with the issue, but then why should they? We discovered the shocking fact that passenger and crew health appears to be nobody's responsibility. At the House of Lords inquiry in 2000, the HSE stated it had no active responsibilities in relation to the health of airline passengers or crew, and the CAA stated it had no direct responsibilities for passenger health or comfort.
As I understand it, once an aircraft takes off, the health of the passengers, the risk to their health, seems to be of nobody's concern. The Health and Safety Executive said nothing to do with us. They're not on British soil any longer, or Australian soil for that matter. They're out there in the airspace. And yet at the same time, the CAA and other comparable organisations, they say it's nothing to do with them. Now, surely the health of the passengers should be the responsibility of some regulator. I don't know which, but somebody should take the rap.
Even if it was the CAA's responsibility, the CAA's Corporate Affairs Department advised us that the CAA is totally funded by industry. So many would ask, can they be completely unbiased?
The fact that it's been going on for so long is an indication of the effort which has been put into stopping this information getting into the public domain.
So, how serious a flight safety issue is this?
If a pilot has got an intense headache or is feeling vertigo or has some other problem that impairs his ability to do his job properly, then of course that's a major flight safety issue.
There are numerous air contamination incidents worldwide affecting safety as well as health, many of which are not documented or ignored due to underreporting or complacency. Here are 5 examples where crews became partially or fully incapacitated, but we have details of many others. A lot of people tell us the writing is on the wall for a serious accident.
I was a check and training flight attendant on that aircraft, and I was frequently unable to recall my emergency evacuation and impact drills. Obviously, from a safety perspective, that would have impacted my efficiency in safely evacuating that aircraft.
Certainly we've had instances where the safety of flight has been placed in jeopardy. We've had a pilot who's collapsed at the controls. There have been reports of other pilots being affected. Fortunately enough, other operating crew on the flight weren't affected and the aircraft has landed safely, but having a pilot impaired on the flight deck is unacceptable.
This is a health and safety issue. We're flight attendants and our job foremost is the health and safety of the passengers. We've been trained to evacuate an aircraft in 60 to 90 seconds. If you're incapacitated, how are you going to do that? And how many passengers are going to die because you're not there 100% because of contaminated air?
What do the unions and crews have to say?
The view that any contamination is acceptable in an aircraft is unacceptable to us in a working environment.
All the health bulletins that we received said that the amount of molecules in the exposure wouldn't be harmful, and it all read that it was within safe limits and that we shouldn't be concerned.
We have been told by unions and crew members that aircraft contamination events are recurring on most commercial jet aircraft types, although some are more frequent offenders than others, such as the BAE 146, Boeing MD-80 and Boeing 757.
There was a culture of intimidation. People were told they had jobs. If they complained about the oil fumes, there would be, did they want the job or not?
There is no doubt that most of the aircrew in National Jet have been intimidated by the events that have occurred to me into not reporting defects, because they know that if they do, then the messenger will be shot. National Jet has issued statements to its crew by memorandum saying that if they are found to be sensitive to fumes, then they have an obligation to reassign them to other duties if duties are available. The implication that if duties aren't available, they will be sacked.
And you're in a situation such as we have at the moment, a pilot has been terminated as a result of this issue. Pilots are more interested in protecting their family income. Obviously they're going to take some risks, which is unfortunate, but again, this is where the regulatory authority should be stepping in and taking some responsibility.
One BAE 146 operator recently acknowledged in a 2003 Australian Industrial Relations Commission hearing that it could not provide a particular pilot a safe working environment, given that it could not adhere to the pilot's doctor's recommendation that he be provided a work environment free of cabin air contamination, stating the pilot would be placed at risk if this could not be met.
In France, we currently have a problem with air contamination on various aircraft. It's really a problem, and we need to find solution because it's health and safety problem.
There are very few exposure standards that apply in the aircraft environment. Those that do apply are outdated, and it's inappropriate to refer to these outdated standards and say, well, the exposures are within these standards, so it's perfectly safe and there's no explanation for why these people are sick.
It's obvious that this is a tactic by the airlines to make sure that pilots and flight crew, flight attendants, don't make the reports about the fume incidents, because they know then that if they make the reports, if they say my health is affected, then the way to get rid of that evidence is to sack them, and eventually that's what's been happening. So instead of doing something about the health, instead of doing something about the design problem in the aircraft, what they do is they waste the people.
The ITF has aviation members in over 130 countries, and we represent in excess of 1 million aviation workers. Of those, over a third are cabin crew, so about a third of 1 million cabin crew in more than 120 countries are part of the ITF community. And that community of cabin crew and that community of pilots is saying loud and clear, we've got a problem here, we need to tackle it, we need to tackle it in a sensible and reasonable way. But what we cannot do is continue to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that if we ignore or deny the existence of these cases of contamination, that somehow we will be able to wish them away. Unfortunately, we cannot wish away the serious neurological illnesses and other complaints that we have seen amongst an increasing number of crew in different parts of the world.
What always worries us is that at the moment we're dealing with tech crew and cabin crew effects. No one's dealing with the passengers. There could be significant impact upon the passengers, which have longer term impact upon commercial interests, but the companies at this point are hoping that the matter will go away.
Airlines seem to be unwilling to advise passengers when they've been exposed to air contamination, and therefore passengers may walk off their flight with symptoms but not aware what caused them.
What is very important here too is that people, as we know, not on all flights but on a very significant numbers worldwide every year, those people will get exposed and they won't be told by the airlines that they've been exposed. They won't be told what they've been exposed to. And how could they benefit appropriate medical care, which is deserved for such exposures, if they're not told that they've been exposed, the chemical they've been exposed to? This is common sense to inform people. They would do that in all other single industry to whichever other kind of exposures. So why not in aviation? This is common sense. This is even human rights.
So, what do industry and the regulators have to say? With the mounting evidence of health problems and flight safety issues, we asked industry to comment. In Australia, we approached the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the Department of Transport, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission, who all had no comment or were unwilling to participate. In the United Kingdom, both the Civil Aviation Authority and the Air Accidents Investigations Branch were both unwilling to participate. In the US, neither the Federal Aviation Administration or the engine oil manufacturer were willing to participate in the programme. So industry is unwilling to comment and the oil manufacturer will not reveal what all the ingredients in the oil are. Also, the oil manufacturer is not willing to discuss the synergistic and other effects of the oil ingredients burnt at high temperatures on crews or passengers.
If a flight is being jeopardised, if a crew becomes impaired because it's inhaling a substance, whether it be a cigarette or some form of drug or in this case the fumes coming from the burnt oil, obviously it impacts upon the safety of flight. Therefore CASA has a responsibility as a safety operator and as the regulator in Australia airspace to deal with it.
Industry accepts that there may be a general health issue but denies there is any evidence linking contaminated air to any particular aircraft type or lubricant.
There's absolutely no doubt in our minds that there is a general health issue here. The number of people who have symptoms indicates that there is a general issue. What I'm trying to point out is that the leap from having a general health issue back to the fact that there is a fundamental problem with either the mobile oil or this aircraft is not backed up by any kind of evidence.
That contradicts the CAA, who not only deny there is a link but failed a pilot's medical licence, stating, "You may be suffering from some sort of chemical exposure in the BAE 146. And Captain Soddy may be suffering from long-term exposure to organophosphate chemicals."
And the Civil Aviation Authority then eventually grounded me on the perfectly legitimate grounds that I was a possible danger to flight safety, but on the probability that I was suffering from organophosphate poisoning.
Flight crew have to undergo strict medical exams to enable them to fly, but these appear to be flawed.
And at one period when I was not flying voluntarily, I continued to have my 6-monthly medical check. And although I felt that I was not able to fly and I wouldn't have flown, the Civil Aviation Authority passed me fit to fly.
The engineers too are under pressure not to recognise the fume problem. The engineer's job is to turn that airplane around within half an hour or 45 minutes and get it back out there flying again. Quite often what would happen is that engineers would walk on the aeroplane and sniff the air and say they couldn't smell anything. Or they would inspect the ducting by getting a finger, running across the duct, going like this and saying, "It's fine, return to service." One of the really frustrating things I used to do was to write NSOF across the defect, meaning not safety of flight. How can you have an aeroplane giving toxic fumes into the cabin and call it not safety of flight?
When industry says that breathing oil is not harmful and that what crews are experiencing is all in their minds, they're actually being very selective in their use of information. The Society of Automotive Engineers in 1981 put out an aerospace industry report, Environmental Control System Contamination. At temperatures above 320 degrees, this oil breaks down into irritating and toxic compounds.
Let's look at the Australian Senate inquiry. Around the world, carrying on day to day as normal and with industry apparently not doing anything to address the health and safety issues of aircraft air contamination, one man finally took the brave step to tackle the problem. It's become known in the industry as the Australian Senate inquiry, and it took off in November 1999. This man was Senator John Woodley, who is now retired and a reverend in Queensland, Australia. The inquiry brought industry around the table and looked at detailed evidence from both sides. When it was completed in October 2000, 53 people had given evidence and 8 recommendations were made, but have yet to be actioned. A references committee has been set up by the Civil Aviation Authority to look at the recommendations, but has not invited independent scientific and medical experts to participate. The Senate inquiry provided an interesting insight into the industry position.
This is an occupational health and safety issue. We are an aviation safety regulator. That's not meant to show in any way that we're not tracking the situation, aware of the situation, or concerned about the situation. But it is well outside the standard expertise of the aviation regulator, who is concerned about what are effectively the short to medium term effects on aviation safety.
The regulatory bodies, as admitted by CASA yesterday, are not competent to rule in such a highly specialised area. Neither are the airlines nor the manufacturers.
I contacted the FAA about the incident and could receive no information. I wrote 31 congressmen that had been involved in a congressional act concerning cabin air quality in 2001, and not one of them responded to my issues.
When it comes to taking responsibility for this issue, everybody wants to pass the buck. I mean, at the end of the day, if it's not the aviation regulator's responsibility, then whose responsibility is it?
There is no doubt that all aircraft from time to time suffer fumes within the aircraft. I think we've accurately reflected that that's a feature of the basic design of air conditioning systems in aircraft, being bleed air from engines, and that on occasions engines leak.
I think we all acknowledge, we've acknowledged it tonight here, that the modifications won't solve the problem completely, that they are to reduce the number of events, and that's what's important.
That's
and
important.
These events do occur on other airplane types.
What is the legal view? Although the airline industry denies the problem, it has made a growing number of payments in the form of workers' civil and pilot loss of medical compensation to crews. These are often done out of court, and one has to wonder why they're paying if contaminated air is harmless.
We settled in the end of July 2002 last year. We settled the workers' compensation claim and the civil matter all in one in an out-of-court settlement, which had taken nearly 5 years. During that time, they had followed, harassed, photographed, and made my life hell.
Well, I think we've got to look at what other big corporations have done in similar instances. Look at the tobacco industry. For years and years and years, the tobacco industry refused to admit that there was a link with health problems and smoking. Years and years they did, and even today they only reluctantly admit it. And what's evidence? What's 100% proof? I mean, at the end of the day, you can't prove anything 100%, I guess. And that is the way in which big corporations wriggle out of their responsibility for causing tremendous health problems. The tobacco industry itself finally has been nailed down on this, but look how long it took. And eventually this whole issue of chemical sensitivity caused by fumes in aircraft, caused by agricultural chemicals, etc., it'll be nailed down, but it'll be after people have died, their lives have been ruined, their careers have been ruined, and it's going to take all of that before we'll be able to say it's been proved conclusively.
What are the conclusions?
At the end of the day, it is a difficult problem. It's a big problem. It's a politically sensitive problem, and no one wants to take the ball and run with it.
People have developed symptoms, and there's been a tendency not to attribute these symptoms to chemical exposures, and this has generally delayed treatment. But it is a most important thing that's going on not only in the airlines but in all sorts of industries. When people are exposed to chemicals, there is a general aversion to labelling them as such, and this really needs to be faced up to.
17 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences in the US said that there was no federal government agency that was acting on the problem of toxic cabin air. And today, 17 years later, we still don't have a federal government agency that's dealing with this problem. That has got to stop.
Many people probably believe it only happens to pilots and stewardesses. I'm a passenger who took one flight and was exposed for just over 3 hours, and this one incident changed my life forever.
When I read some of this material, I suddenly realised why one day I had been very ill after a flight to Kununurra, and I had many of the symptoms that have been described by both Professor Winder and the company doctor. And I now can fully understand what the crews are going through and what many passengers go through. This cannot be afforded to be ignored any longer.
And I challenge the airlines, if the airlines are genuinely concerned about the safety of their passengers, the safety of their customers, I challenge those airlines to permit independent researchers on board aircraft to take air samples in a properly scientific way and to analyse those independently in order that we can get to the bottom of this problem.
I loved my job. It was a dream job. I was 25 years old when this happened to me, and it shouldn't happen to people like this. It shouldn't happen to anyone.
You know, I'd been hearing all different things about the fumes, and you know, I was a little bit sceptical myself at the beginning because I didn't quite understand it, and until I experienced it and knew what it felt like, it really just made me realise that it was serious.
Pilots and flight attendants are not going to speak out because they jeopardise their jobs. Word gets around in the airline industry, they know what happens to you, they will not speak out while they're flying until it's too late and they're sick.
And the irony is that if we do have an accident, it won't be an accident because everyone knows about it.
My whole experience of the inquiry and since then is of an amazing cover-up, right through from the top of government, through the safety bureaucrats, through to the airlines and the manufacturers themselves. All of them really have not been prepared to admit the extent of this problem, and I guess it's because it would be a massive cost to change the way in which air is fed into the air conditioning system in the cabin. But at the end of the day, that's the only way you're going to fix what is a very serious health problem.
Whilst industry and government sit in the cities and are clearly failing to address the issue of aircraft air contamination, crews and passengers continue to get sick and no longer fly. Ironically, some of the aircraft that caused them to get sick now sit motionless, having completed their task. The task: make profit. Flight safety, passengers and crew health secondary. Surely this has to change.